So a brief bit of background for what's happening here. Washington, D.C. is a federal enclave it is property of the federal government. Congress in 1973 passed a law, the Home Rule Act, that creates the current D.C. government, and that is D.C.'s local government. And that has three branches. And that law gave a bunch of authority to both the mayor of D.C., the executive, and the D.C. Council, the legislature, both of whom are elected. And the federal government still has control over federal institutions, in D.C., like national parks, right, or monuments, but ordinary law enforcement is done by D.C. officers.
And a key thing to emphasize is that the federal government has substantially more power and authority over D.C. than it does over other places like New York or Los Angeles. So technically, the D.C. National Guard, unlike other state National Guards, is commanded by the president, and it may undertake federal missions without being federalized. The fact that the D.C. National Guard is controlled by the president is one of the reasons that it was so conspicuous and so concerning when President Trump did not call up the Guard to respond to January 6th. So the president has this power, but the D.C. National Guard is actually quite small.
And so the president tried to do something else and rely on a provision in the Home Rule Act that also gives the president power to use the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, quote, for federal purposes, whenever he determines that special conditions of an emergency nature exist, end quote. That authority lasts for 30 days when he informs Congress. And again, it gives him control over them for purposes of doing like federal presidential priorities, but doesn't mean and shouldn't mean, he tells them how to do things like enforce D.C. law. We're going to come back to this power in a second because, surprise, there are questions about whether it is being lawfully used here.